Welcome to Baptist Bridges, a podcast by the Canadian Baptists of Ontario and Quebec. We will explore a variety of topics that we trust will be meaningful to people and churches around the world. We're glad you're here. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our podcast, Baptist Bridges. Today, I'm excited to enter into a discussion about a topic that may be something many of us haven't thought about before, or maybe it will be something that you've thought about a lot, and it has seemed like wishful thinking. Maybe it's something you've experienced, and you wish other people could. We're going to be talking about, should we sabbatical? Sabbaticals have become more commonplace in many of our churches and ministries, and today I'm pleased to have two guests who are going to introduce themselves to start, tell us a sentence or two about your ministry, and then we're going to get into their stories and experiences of sabbatical that we hope can help your church to learn and think about this topic. So first of all, my name is Leanne Friesen. I'm the Executive Minister of CBOQ, and I will start by saying that I have had a sabbatical in 2018. After 15 years at my church, I was gifted 4 months of sabbatical, which were life-changing for me. Next to my right is Reverend Dr. Ken Foo, who is our Director of Church Life and Leadership. Tell us more about yourself, Ken.
Well, hello, CBOQ. I'm the Director of Church Life and Leadership with CBOQ, but I had my sabbatical with my church back in 2016, and I had a 6-month sabbatical with my church at that time.
Fabulous. And the person that may be a face people will know less, new to the podcast, is Curtis Lai. Tell us where you're serving and about your role.
Hi, my name's Curtis. Thank you for having me first and foremost. It's a pleasure to be here. I am the youth pastor at a church in North York, North Toronto Chinese Baptist Church. I'm a father of 2, husband of 1, and I'm actually currently finishing my sabbatical right now, actually.
Fabulous. Yeah. Thank you for taking time to be with us today. Well, I think we have to start by talking about what a sabbatical is. So let's say a few things that sabbatical is not. Sabbatical isn't a vacation. We can talk about these things more. Mm-hmm. Sabbatical isn't if someone has to take sick leave or long-term disability. Sabbatical isn't parental leave. None of those things are sabbatical. Those are other reasons people may not be working in the way they once were. So Ken, maybe you could help us by describing sabbatical and where the idea comes from scripturally.
Sure. I mean, sabbatical is obviously from that main word Sabbath, and we get that from creation, when God created the world, and on the 7th day he rested. And within that framework, he continues to remind us that, hey, if I created the world and it, in 6 days, and I took a time to rest, it's something sacred about that special day to just rest or step back from all the things that we're doing. And then obviously he carries it forward into the commandments, right? To keep the Sabbath and to make it holy. And then even Jesus would represent that. We would maybe have some controversy now about whether we still keep Sabbath laws and all that stuff. But Jesus always withdrew every time before he engaged in ministry, and just gave us an example of that ability to withdraw, to rest, to come into the presence of God. And so in all these areas of scripture, you have this rhythm of finding a time to rest and a time to engage. And, on a bigger scale, every 7 years, there was that time where the land was supposed to rest as well. And so God invites us to consider, what are those rhythms that we have? And so not only is it a weekly rhythm that we invite people to think about rest, Sabbath, coming into the presence of God, but what does it look like professionally as pastors or ministers? And what does that look like on that bigger rhythm of what does it look like in 7 years? What does that rest look like? How do we engage back, take a step back from ministry, come into the presence of God, do some spiritual practices, determine where things are now? So that's kind of the backdrop, I think, of how we get this idea of Sabbath.
And anyone who's in the academic world would often hear about sabbatical, right? We would know that we would hear professors taking sabbatical, and that would be time that they'd step back from teaching to do research, to learn. And we've carried that over in a number of church traditions that says this is a time where you do rest and you do step back,
but you shift to a different season. And so in sabbatical, rarely in the ones that I know is it simply taking time off. But in my case, I know I had to make a proposal of how I would use the time. And so the things that I would learn, which included taking some courses, it included visiting some churches, doing some interviewing of pastors to learn some different things, all things that would feed into me in order to start a new season of ministry. So that is a wonderful description of it. Usually sabbaticals can be 1 month, a year, 6 months. Mine was 4 months. It's a stretch of time that's decided to say, take a step back and do ministry in a different way. So Curtis, you said you're in the middle. Well, you're on the tail end of your sabbatical. So I would love to hear your sabbatical story. Tell us about your experience, why you decided to take one, what it looks like in your church, what you had to do to get one, and what it's been like for you.
Yeah, that's a good question. So at our church, similar to what you guys have already alluded to, we have a policy for pastors to take a sabbatical every 7 years of serving in the ministry at that church. And it goes up to 6 months. And so my sabbatical is on the 6th month currently. And just like you mentioned, Leanne, I had to also formulate a plan beforehand with my church leaders. We worked with them, with the deacons at our church before I even entered into the season. Before even considering taking sabbatical, I went through that discernment process with them, came up with a plan, and then I pretty much took my sabbatical at the 7/8 year mark when I was able to. And during this time, it's been exactly what you just mentioned as well, a time for retreating with God, a time to reflect, a time to focus on my own personal mental health, family health, ministry health, and even just taking a look very honestly at some of the things that have been going on in my life. And so it's been a very enlivening time for all of those things. And spiritually, I think, very refreshing.
What made you decide? You said that your church has this process where pastors can take one every 7 years. I'm guessing not everyone does. You have a bigger church because there'd be lots of pastors at your church. So they would have been through this before. Yep. What made you say, I'm going to pursue that? I think I'd like to do that.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I really wrestled with that, I think, beforehand as well. For me, a couple of things came up. I'll say 3 things. So the first was opportunity. I know not every church has this policy laid out in their church. And so by God's grace, our church is very generous with this, and they allow our pastors to actually take a sabbatical. And we have had previous pastors in our history do that. So there was opportunity for me to do it. There was viability for me to do so as well. I think practically it was possible for me to actually take that 6 months to take time to work on those things and not have ministry utterly fall apart. And I'm sure we'll get to that a little bit later as well in our conversation. And lastly, I'll say curiosity. To a degree, I was just really interested to see what this process would be like for the church, for myself, I think, on an individual level, and to see how things would go. I think when I was thinking about this, there was a quote that came up from Augustine, which is that quote of, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. And I was just curious, okay, if I take these months off and sabbatical well, and not treat it like a vacation, but really just to retreat and take time with God, am I going to be restless about wanting to go back to work, about making ministry my everything? And has it become my everything to a degree where I've lost sight of maybe my first love for God? And maybe I've grown this restlessness where I need to be working all the time to feel like I'm of any worth or value and to do what I'm meant to do. And so I was curious, if I take this time off, how am I going to respond to this time off? And I think that's been a journey in and of itself too, these last couple of months.
So has that happened? Do you feel like, what has that journey been like of thinking about who am I if I'm not pastoring all the time?
Right. And I think that's been an ongoing kind of question to ask and to answer throughout these last couple of months. It's been interesting because I think the answer has kind of ebbed and flowed throughout the last couple of months of different season of our church going through seasons too, of it's busier during Christmas, or as a youth pastor, it's busier in September when I actually started my sabbatical. And there were times where I felt way more relaxed about taking a step back. And then there were moments where definitely there was a temptation to feel not only, oh, the church might really need me right now. Maybe I'll just do this one thing and go back for this one ministry. And then also just realizing that attached to that was this I think, very real sense of, okay, is this my identity? Is this where I find my identity? Being a pastor, first and foremost, doing this ministry A, ministry B, or is my identity first and foremost rooted in Christ as a child of God and allowing him to dictate what I'm to do with my day to day? And so that has been an interesting learning process. I think God has shown me places in my heart where I do have a natural restlessness to want to work. And maybe that comes from my specific context and my culture as well, and my background of I need to work to be feeling like I'm useful and like people aren't judging me, especially in a Chinese context church where I come from. That's a big thing. People are naturally going to default to saying, oh, Curtis is just taking 6 months off to do nothing and we're still paying him. Like, that's not fair. And so I had to wrestle with that as well. And just that maybe
it comes with guilt.
Comes with guilt.
Yeah, because not every congregant gets to do that.
Exactly.
Right?
And so I think those have all been really good learning lessons and has revealed a lot in terms of just my own heart and where that's at with all those topics.
It takes a while. I found when I was on sabbatical, I was shocked at how long it took me to actually let myself be on sabbatical. I realized how much my identity was wrapped up in it. And the first week I was on sabbatical, I spent an entire day in hospital with a woman whose father was on life support from the church because I said, well, you know, it's an emergency. I need to be there. I had a list of people to visit that were not from my church, but a friend who'd just been diagnosed with cancer. And I thought, oh, now I have time to do that. And I realized I'm just shifting pastoring. I still needed to wake up each day and have this task before me. And I really resonate with that. And God did a big work in me in challenging that in me. What about you, Ken? You're nodding. You resonate with that?
Oh, yeah, very much so. I mean, when I took my sabbatical, I think the biggest thing was, at least I had our senior pastor do a sabbatical first. And one of the things that I took from that was he led by example, and it helped the church be ready for when any of us were supposed to go for sabbatical. So I think back to that, just knowing, oh, someone did that ahead of time. I can follow suit in that. But those first few months, I was itchy. Like, I was itchy I'm like, on Sunday, where do I go? What do I do? I visited a church and all I could think was critiquing their worship service. I was critiquing, why did they pick this song? How is that sermon? That sermon wasn't very exegetical, and I started going all over the place with it. And so all of a sudden it was just being able to pause for a second and go, wait, this is really a time to step back. Someone can feed me instead of me feeding everyone. Why do I hold these various perspectives? Where did they come from? What theological background am I bringing to this? But is it right? Is it true? Is it where I should be? I think maybe one difference for me, I don't know about your context, but I actually was at that point in my studies in thesis writing mode. So my sabbatical came at a time when I also was finishing my doctorate degree. And so it helped me also to clear out some space to kind of do that part of finishing up education pieces as well. So that was something I valued because I was grinding between ministry and studying. And then all of a sudden I had this extra space now to kind of bear down on the last few pieces of this doctorate stuff. And then it really helped me finish it off well. So that was a blessing too, that the timing of all that kind of worked for me. But yeah, those first few months, I was pulling my hair out, didn't know what to do with myself.
It's interesting because each of us mentioned that we did have to have a proposal of how we'd use the time. So I'd love to, and this might be helpful as churches, if you're thinking about this as a church or as a pastor, you could ask a pastor what their proposal included. And I had a very detailed proposal. I used 4 words. I'm blanking on some of them now, but they were rest, adventure, learn, and a 4th one. But the things that I did over sabbatical were I wanted to explore churches that had multiple services because our church was growing. So I intentionally visited churches and met with pastors to talk about that and learn about that in a space that I wasn't trying to run church services at the same time. Time to rest. I audited a couple courses, and auditing's fun because you don't have to write the papers, but I had a chance to learn, and I had a series of books I would read. adventure was engaging in some different ministries. And the other thing I wanted to learn about was different church worship styles. So I went to 14 different churches in 4 months. And then I ended up writing a lot about that. And I learned so much. Like, it changed our church so much just by attending 14 different churches and just showing up on a Sunday. And how that shaped our church, I think, was really helpful. But it was interesting, again, how much I was still constantly measuring myself all the time. So it's an interesting balance of feeling that sense of we still want to earn this time and use it well, but also realize we're tasked to receive it as a gift. What did your proposals or ideas look like? You said you did some doctoral work. What have you been exploring?
Yeah, so I had a couple categories of things that I knew I wanted to use the time for. One of them was academic as well. And so did some continued just personal education and learning. One of them was mental health as well. So I took some really intentional time to meet on a more regular cadence with my Christian therapist and did some counseling with her. And that's been going wonderfully. And just taking some time to even unpack things from childhood and traumas and things like that to help me become, I think, in a better mental space to return. And so that was the second category. And then a third for me was just family health and just working on that in very intentional ways too. For context, we have 2 littles at home. We have 2 young kids turning 6 and 3. And so my wife was very keen on me taking this sabbatical. And it's proved to be a wonderful time for us to also have, I think, really healthy conversations about things in our family and in our marriage and in our church, things that normally on paper we'd want to be talking about anyways if I was working. But if we were honest, like, the bandwidth for that is just less when you're full-time in ministry. And so for us, sabbatical gave us time to really designate specific conversations and to have them and to use that time for family as well.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything you'd add about what you used during the time for?
Well, yeah, mine was a lot on learning, not just, another degree, but learning like other churches. So I visited churches. It was really for vision impact, I think, is how I probably posited mine, was to say we were at a crux point at our church that things were shifting and changing, and I just had to take time to explore what is the vision that God has for us and our congregation. And so just being open to seeing other churches, understanding hospitality or welcoming churches, and finding churches that really knew how to welcome people well. And when you go in as a stranger, you can get firsthand experience of that. But just seeing also, how churches do things differently, because you get tunnel vision with your own context. You only see what you see, and you lead a certain way all the time, and just finding different places that would do things slightly differently so that you would find some innovation in that. So for me, that was that added piece where it was just a matter of discerning vision and moving forward. And also finding space to actually, I'm a little weird like this, but I actually would want to get ahead in preaching. So I was crafting year-long preaching series and sets that, this would be a great way to advance the vision of our congregation through the preaching, and having time to kind of, project out for a year or two and say, if we're going to change vision, how do we use the pulpit for that, and to be able to preach into series like that and do that as well. So that was part of it as in preparation.
Yeah, you were able to think big picture. I'm hearing a few themes. I'm hearing with you, Curtis, lots of really thinking about who you are, what the life that you need to live, dealing with things in yourself. So powerful. And again, that ability to think big picture, to think when you strip away the day to day, to be looking at the big picture, which is so valuable. But the one that keeps coming up in its different forms is also this question of identity, which I'm finding really interesting. And I wrote a blog post after sabbatical. There's 2 stories that come to my mind. One was, and I wrote about the image of the ephod. And I don't know if you can remember those. It's mentioned in the Old Testament. And it's this really heavy jeweled plate that priests were given to wear. And I remember reading, for some reason, that must have just been where I was in scripture at the start of my sabbatical, and getting overwhelmed by this image of these priests who had to wear what would have been such a heavy chest plate. It would have been so heavy. It was their marker as a priest. And thinking, I'm taking off the ephod. Like this, I have to kind of just take this off. And how much it did feel like taking off a weight and think and almost feeling naked, right? Almost feeling like I don't have this armor on anymore. Does that image resonate with either of you?
Oh, very much so. Like that. Yeah, for sure. That was one of the biggest pieces, this weight of ministry that you carry. And yeah, I mean, even on sabbatical, you know, we had a congregant pass away suddenly, and you could just feel, I remember feeling all the weight of, what do I need to do? Do I need to get involved? Do I need to reach out? Do I need to help with the funeral? And just all of a sudden, yeah, I remember just feeling all that weight. But our church had actually hired someone in the interim while I was on sabbatical. And I said, no, trust God in the process here. Like, this is, if I'm saying I'm on sabbatical, trusting God that he's got this ministry. It's not me who's got this ministry, even though I like to take ownership of it, right? But it's really God's at the end of the day. And to trust that he is the one who's going to do that. And, you know, for a person who has a lot of trust issues, that needs to get worked out, right? But finding that, yeah, I had to wrestle with my identity, like, especially, I thought this was me, it's mine. I'm responsible for this. And no, I'm not. It's God's, and he will be responsible for it. And to be able to trust that and lean into that, that was heavy for me. I still, even to this day, can remember the heaviness of that moment.
Yeah, I totally resonate with that as well. I think to add another layer for my story of my sabbatical experience so far, which sounds a little different from the two of yours, is I actually have still been attending my home church regularly.
Which is totally,
which
some do and some don't yet.
Yeah, and that's also because my children are there, my wife's there, and so we love the children's ministry at our church, and they have a community that we want them to continue to plug into. And so that whole ephod and taking it off totally resonates with me, because I felt naked walking in Sunday that first couple of months, and feeling like all eyes were on me, and he's still here, and he hasn't run away, and all that. Our family, I think it just worked out this way, was overseas when I started my sabbatical, so that did help. It really did feel like, okay, I'm forcing myself to get away and to develop a new identity and to put on a different, maybe uniform for this season, or just outfit for this season, and take off that armor that I'm used to. I think that's really well put. And so we were overseas while I started my sabbatical, and I think that really helped, just to get away physically, force myself, so I didn't have a chance to fly back, 15 hours to church on a Sunday. But that did help, and yet even with that, it still felt a little different walking into the church doors that first Sunday, I remember, and just people greeting and being like, "Oh, you're still here," and like, "Oh, and just getting that question, "How's sabbatical been going?" And finding it actually like difficult to answer at times, because you don't want to sound ungrateful for the fact that you're getting this gift and that you're getting this experience. And so I almost feel pressure to never have to say anything negative about it, or that it's challenging or whatnot. But that's a whole other thing, I think, to interact with congregants about that.
I think we should dig into that. First of all, thank you for naming that, there's different ways sabbatical. You stayed at your church, you might leave. So again, just naming that, you kind of have to figure out how these things go. I was going to ask from here a question about, what pushback did you get in terms of, you think about sabbatical? What's some of the things you heard, some of the negatives, some of the concerns? We're going to get into some of the concerns that we might have felt personally later, both internally, externally. But I think your question addresses that, because how do we deal with either it being said out loud and we need to answer the question, or we just feel guilty ourselves because we're serving these congregants whose tithes pay our salary and we're like, "Hey, I'm on sabbatical. Cool. I know that you might only get 2 weeks vacation a year." And most pastors I know said they found that difficult. How do you answer that question? How did you deal with that feeling?
Well, fortunately, I go to a Chinese church, so we're all passive aggressive, and so no one's going to say it out loud. So I haven't actually, by God's grace.
If I may, I did actually have a friend who said on her
wow.
sabbatical,
Okay.
like a congregant was like, "Well, that must be nice," and was really kind of snarky about it.
Yeah, so
and it really hurt their feelings, And they had a conversation about it, but she was like, "I just had to realize that was just them wishing they could have a sabbatical, right?" And they didn't, they didn't resent me. They were just like, "I wish I could do that too." But as someone who is very caring, felt guilty. But you said no one said it to you.
No one has said it to me directly, explicitly. I don't think I've received any like looks or anything like that either. I think it's more an internal kind of wrestling. And I think people, it might come across a little bit from others when they ask, like, oh, so what do you do on your sabbatical now, day to day, and things like that. But I think most of the conflict actually comes internally. And I think you mentioned this earlier, Leanne, feeling like I need to work for this, or have I deserved this? And I think that's a really tricky thing. And that's something that I've been wrestling with through over the last couple of months as well, which is doubly hard because it's hard to wrestle with that. At the same time, I'm having, these wonderfully fruitful experiences, both personally and also with my family and my family at home, and yet that guilt still creeps up every now and then. So I think what's really helped is sitting down with congregants and making time, which I still do, and just reach out to people that now we have more time and bandwidth to reach out to. They'll ask the questions like, how's it been going? And just sharing very openly with them both the victories and the joys, and yes, the blessings of having time, but also the struggle, right? Just being real with them and being like, hey, yeah, like I wrestle with whether people are going to just see this as a vacation, whether I'm wrestling with that internally.
Whether I deserve it.
Whether I deserve this time away. And I think when people hear that helps, and they understand that, oh, this is actually a bit of a struggle even for pastors sometimes who go on this. And hopefully that'll help them empathize with the fact that this is not an easy thing to do, actually. I think people just assume, oh, that like you said, that must be nice. You get 4 months off, you get 6 months off to vacation, and that's the assumption. But actually the reality is it's really hard to say yes to a sabbatical, I'm sure, for many people. And actually more eyes are on you when you're on sabbatical, and there's more judgment on you, perceived or otherwise, when you're on sabbatical. And so actually to say yes to that is kind of bold and brave in a sense, and takes courage to say that, and then to take that time and focus on the things that God wants you to focus on.
Thank you for that, Curtis. And so both of you, as you've talked about sabbatical, you said like there's all these reasons we feel these internal conflicts, but yet both of you separately used the term with me, but it was transformative. So tell me what's made it transformative. Let's start with you, Ken.
I think it was probably 6 months after I returned to the church and was just going about ministry that many people, I don't know what happened. It was just a day where people just started sort of giving comments to you, and they say, you know what, that sabbatical must have done something to you, because you've come back with a different vibe, but a very strong leadership for where we're going. And there was a lot of comments of that sabbatical must have helped you because you've come back with something deeper. Your preaching is like deeper, your leadership is deeper. So I got a lot of those comments. And I don't know if I was looking internally at how that was shaping me, but it was something enough that people in your own congregation would recognize. I think speaks to something that has transformatively happened to you. I'll tell you where it actually has caused me to reflect is actually when I left that pastoral ministry and joined CBOQ. In that wandering season of stepping away from my church as a pastor into CBOQ in this role, but trying to find where another church to kind of integrate with or be a part of, it was in this season that I looked back at my sabbatical and go, I remember this wandering. I remember this feeling of not knowing where to go, what to do, feeling unsettled, and just kind of leaning into that, going, okay, what did God teach me? What was it that I was learning at that time during my sabbatical of this wandering experience? And what does that mean for me now? And so it was funny because it's in that same seven year, right? 7 years I had a sabbatical, 7 years of ministry, and then I joined CBOQ. And then it was just kind of, I was reflecting on that as I was thinking about our podcast, because it's actually kind of been helpful to process again all those emotions that I felt when I went on sabbatical, feeling disconnected, feeling my identity question again. Am I really a pastor anymore? And then doing this new role, all those kinds of questions and feelings came back again. And it's been interesting to be able to lean into that, going again, just God, you are who I say I am, and allow that to really work itself through, and allow that to really kind of dig deep, make deep roots into my own heart to say, peel back this layer. Why did you think that that's who you are? Why do you think that's who you are? Why do you think that's who you are? These are all performance things that you do. They're not who God says I am. And so that was really key for me now that I look back on it. And in the midst of it, I know I wrestled with that a lot. So, yeah.
You also named earlier in there, and I've heard you say too, Curtis, that you learn to trust, right? You learn to trust, oh, actually, God's got this church, right? You realize, oh, if I'm not there every day, can you believe that the church keeps going, that somehow God manages this? And when you've had the chance to truly realize that, to leave it with God tangibly, knowing you're not back after your week's vacation to tidy, check all the emails again, you can use that memory again, right? When you're back in the wilderness, you're like, oh, I can still trust God. Why did you use the word transformative, Curtis?
I think a lot of what Ken said I resonate with as well. I don't have the hindsight of looking back yet on this season. I'm hopeful and prayerful that those moments might come. For me, as I was thinking and reflecting on even just these last 5, now almost 6 months, one analogy kept coming up in my mind of this image of a couple's retreat. And so like super contextually relevant to me now because I have 2 young kids at home, and we sometimes talk about date night, and date nights are something we try to build into a regular routine. And we hear about these couples more and more taking these weekend retreats and getting away. And I think our initial reaction as husband and wife is just like, people can do that? Like, aren't the kids going to like suffer? Like, what's going to happen? And I think I realize more and more, actually, that's a really apt analogy, a couple's retreat, for what the sabbatical season has been like for me. And so in the day-to-day grind of just family life, it's so easy to just be on cruise control. And I think as pastors, the week to week can feel like you're on cruise control with God and with the church and just doing ministry. And this idea of getting away and taking time, designated intentional time to get away in the context of marriage and with the analogy of a couple's retreat allows you and your spouse to really see how you're doing and to make sure that your love for each other is first, because that's what's going to fuel your family. And as a pastor, I think it's just been so transformative for me to take this time to take that couple's retreat with God and to make sure that my love for him is also first, and that that's fueling my ministry. It's not me. It's not my desire to please the church. It's not my desire to fulfill a certain ministry goal or to reach a certain destination, but really I am being fueled day in, day out by hopefully abiding in the vine just regularly and making sure that he is my life support, that I'm getting all that I'm getting from him and doing it because of my relationship with him first. And I think, I think that's been so helpful for me to see so clearly during this time. And it's been transformative in the sense that I've been able to see specific ways that that's been the case, that my relationship with God is fueling ministry. And I think it's been transformative also in the way that he has shown me ways maybe I've made it something else. And maybe it's just been on cruise control without much asking God for help and relying on my own strengths and relying on the strength of my leaders and relying on other things. And so it's been really helpful to have my eyes open to all of that.
Wow. Thank you, Curtis. This seems like a perfect time to take a little pause as we're thinking about this.
Hey friends, mark your calendars for CBOQ Assembly 2025. It will be held at Brock University in St. Catharines. We're looking forward to gathering as a family to learn, encourage, and uplift one another. Keep an eye out for more information. We hope to see you there.
Welcome back. I've just been loving this conversation about sabbatical, which has somehow turned into a conversation about trusting God and a conversation about our identity in Christ. And that's what sabbatical often does for us. Before we continue, I often like after the break to do a little bit of a rapid fire. Now, pastors, this means 1-sentence answers. Can you do it? We're going to see. Okay. So what I'm going to say is 1-sentence answers. What would you say to? And I'm going to share reasons that a pastor might say, I can't do sabbatical or I shouldn't do sabbatical. What would be your short answer? So here's the first one. I'm too busy to take a sabbatical.
I had an answer.
The silence is palpable.
I had an answer.
It's a hard one, isn't it? Because pastors are busy. I mean, part of me feels like I would find myself saying, it's because you're busy that you need a sabbatical.
Yeah, I thought of that too. I think I would just add to that, if you're a pastor who thinks you're too busy to take a sabbatical, it's always going to feel like you're too busy to take a sabbatical.
Nice. Yeah, exactly. And this is a chance to realize that maybe that busyness
might be a symptom of something
is
else.
not the weight that it feels. Yeah. What about someone saying it's self-indulgent? Kind of what we were saying earlier, right? Like, who gets to do this?
I don't know if it's self-indulgent, really. It's actually, what's the word I'm looking for? It's deep introspection that it allows for. And without that, you can run, as Curtis was saying, you can run on cruise control and do every single piece of ministry on your own strength without realizing it. And you've left Jesus outside the church. And so it really, I don't think it's self-indulgent at all. It's actually Jesus-centered.
Would you add anything?
It's only self-indulgent if you think it's synonymous with vacation.
Nice. And
And
we've
then-
already said it's
yeah.
not a vacation.
Dude, edit mine out and just use that one.
Yeah.
Yours is good. Just go
What
for it.
about, and this is a big one, you know what, I actually want to spend a little bit more time on this one. So I'm going to, you know what, I'm going to move this one to the end. How about if I leave, the church won't want me back? Now, I'm going to tell you personally before you respond to that one, that this was a huge one for me. So I started at my church as a lead pastor when I was 27. And one of the questions that, you know, in the, like, what's the term? The preach for the call, like when they have the business meeting, was someone's like, is she going to have kids? And someone said, you know, we shouldn't even be asking that question, which was wonderful. But I'd always wanted to have kids. And I'd been there a year when I got pregnant. And then I was very sick when I was pregnant. And I was often really struggling to do my job in its fullness. And I was missing a lot of work. And I was very afraid that if I took a year off for my maternity leave, that they'd realize they never should have hired me in the first place. That was a genuine fear. Such a fear that when I was throwing up 100 times a day, and I'm not speaking with hyperbole there, I was doing that and hospitalized. I was working from my hospital bed because I wouldn't go on sick leave because I was so afraid that I'd do sick leave and then then I would do my, not sabbatical, my maternity leave. So I really empathize with that feeling of if I go, they might not want me back. I didn't feel it by the time I got to sabbatical, which happened a nice bit after my maternity leave. So that wasn't an answer of what to say. I just want to say I get it. So if I leave, the church won't want me back. What would you say?
They love you enough to give you a sabbatical. They'll love you enough to keep you.
Nice. Do you want to add to that? Because that was like really good.
I can try, but I don't know if I'll add
Yeah.
anything. But the question was, if I leave,
If I leave,
church
the church
won't
won't want me back.
If God wants you back, you'll come back.
Yeah. Yeah. What about, I would get too bored.
That's me. But I found I had to wrestle with something internally. Why am I getting bored? And God actually would show me some stuff to say, it's because you're not choosing me. You're choosing all these other idols instead of me. So
Yeah, that's good. I have nothing to add to that one.
How about, I love my job too much to take a sabbatical.
I'd just say if you love your job that much, take a sabbatical.
Ooh, nice.
I think I would say we're called to love Jesus more than our jobs. And so if
Guys are
you
very
have
good.
started to love your job in replacement of your love for Christ, then maybe a sabbatical is what you need.
Yeah, take mine out. And just
Lots of wisdom in those. So there's a couple more I want to address, and I want to take a couple minutes to talk about what about small churches. So both of you were serving in large churches, multi-staff churches. I was in a smaller church compared to those churches, but we did have a staff of 3, so I had an associate who could fill in. So some of our pastors are hearing this, and the reality is their church doesn't have a lot of extra money. The reality is that if they step down, there isn't someone obvious to preach. So how might we address that situation? That 2 of the lines would be, well, there's no one to fill in, or my church can't afford it. Maybe I'll start with you, Ken. You're head of the church life and leadership department. You understand the dynamics of how these things can come up. So what about a church that says can't afford it, can't get someone to fill in?
Church that can't afford it, I think if you are looking at a sabbatical, it's getting ahead of that, being able to set money aside for that, to find like a guest preacher, an interim preacher or something. So getting ahead of it by putting aside some money. Or hey, the reality too is if you are, as the pastor of the church, if it's something that you're willing to sacrifice a couple $100s in order to give back to your church to support that as well. I don't know, we could look at a grant somewhere down the road?
Well, you know, our church did that. My church where I sabbatical was Mount Hamilton Baptist Church. And about 4 or 5 years before, at the behest of CBOQ suggesting churches do this, so thank you, they just have a sabbatical fund that they put $2,000 in every year. And that's just something that goes in the fund. And by the time I went on sabbatical, there was like $15,000 in it. And then by the time the next person went. And so that was used for pulpit supply and things like that. The church was also reminded that things would look different. So there were some ministries that paused. So in some ways, the church also had a little bit of a sabbatical. And we just said, we're kind of inviting all of you to join in this journey, which I think was important. So I think that preparation is important. And I think recognizing sabbatical could look a lot of different ways. 6 months may not be realistic. Maybe it's 2 months for a church. And I would say you could call CBOQ to talk about this is something we want to do. And we do have things here that offer sabbatical policies and practices. So if this is something a church or a pastor's thinking about, you could absolutely call your regional associate who could give you some tips on starting to work towards that. But you're right. It doesn't always work if you say, I'm exhausted, I'm burnt out. Can I have a sabbatical next month? Instead, often it needs to be part of the church's rhythms, right? That this many we've saved, this is the time it comes. And you're not waiting till the pastor is on their wit's end. And that can often help. Do you want to add anything to that? I know that your experience isn't in a small church. But
I think what you just said, Leanne, was actually really what I was going to say as well. It was really helpful. My church can't afford it. It's actually such a fruitful experience for the church and the congregation to go through sending and blessing their pastor towards taking a sabbatical. Like, I think we've been talking about this conversation from the perspective of the individual pastor, but actually from the perspective of the congregation as a whole and the church as a whole. It's such a faith exercise. And to hear Ken's story so beautifully of how when he returned, the church saw what it did for him and how it actually not only blessed him, but then in turn blessed the congregation and the church for years to come. I think that's what a church gets the opportunity to experience as well, as they decide, yeah, we're going to do this. And it's a test of faith for us, and we're not sure how God's going to supply and how he's going to provide. But I think you can come out of that experience as a congregation, as a family, saying, wow, God is so good. And he was so good to us during the season that we thought we were losing something. No, we were actually gaining something.
That's so beautifully said. I'd love to dig into that just a little bit more. What do we want to say to our churches? So why should churches encourage, I'm not even going to say let. Why should churches encourage their pastors to take a sabbatical?
Well, I think it goes to that other comment there. There's no one to fill in. And oftentimes we take for granted when we have a pastor in a church that the pastor will take care of all these different pieces of the ministry of the church. So much so to the expense of the priesthood of all believers, to the expense that other people could be filling in these roles. And so it's a faith, like I love it. It's a faith exercise where the church can see, oh, we do have people. God has gifted us with these people who can step into all these different roles, all these different areas of ministry, but we've lost a sense of that because we've put all our eggs on the pastor. And so, yeah, the pastor isn't the only one who has to go visit. There are people in our congregation who have that gift of visiting people, loving people who are in hospice care or in the hospitals. There are other people who are prepared to teach because God has gifted the church with all these gifts. And so sometimes we can rely on a pastor, we can rely on our own abilities and strengths, but the church can really rely on the Holy Spirit in this moment to see beyond the human and to go, hey, where is God leading us? Invite the Holy Spirit to come and challenge, why do we have this program? Does this program still need to continue? Maybe it doesn't. It's an opportunity to reevaluate all those different aspects. And so there's no one to fill in. I find that it's a great exercise, as Curtis said, a great exercise of faith for the church to learn and to see God at work doing things differently.
I think pragmatically as well, we do know, and statistics are showing us that pastor burnout is real. And often what happens is a pastor, and we have seen this, we see this in our churches a lot lately, and a church calls them and says, the pastor's gone, we had no idea, they were so burnt out, they're exhausted. And they're actually quitting because they need a rest, not because they really need to stop. And sabbatical prevents that. And so we often see that people will go in sabbatical and it will actually equip them to stay with your church longer. So the idea that, you're losing them for the short time may actually ensure the longevity of how long you'll have them. I just have one or two more questions. Curtis, what would you say people should do to prepare for a sabbatical, to prepare their heart and their soul if they're getting ready to do this?
Okay, as a good Baptist pastor, I'll give you 3 points.
Excellent.
They'll be fast. 3
You're
Ps.
doing great.
I think this helped me a lot in the process. The first is plan, second is partner, and the third is protect. So
And it's alliteration. See what the sabbatical has done for this
yes,
gentleman?
this is all due to my
It's so
sabbatical,
good.
I
Like
know.
the freedom to just
Yeah,
think and
amazing.
be so brilliant.
So the first plan, I think it's what you guys have mentioned already. And for us as a church, it's, you're 7 years away from taking your first sabbatical or your
Yeah.
sabbatical. And so use that time as early as you can to start talking with your leadership team, to start talking about what's going to happen when you're gone and who's going to fill in and what it's going to look like from a day to day. I think partnering and by that I mean partnering with the church, partnering with even your family, like talk with them and figure out what's everyone's expectations for this time going to be? And let's make sure that this is going to be a joint effort and a collaborative effort. Maybe even going back to what we talked about earlier of let's collaborate together and work together as a church leadership team to make sure everyone, even in the congregation, understands why we're doing this and to and preach on that if you need to, or teach on that in some way so that as a church community, you're partnering together to bless and send your pastors towards the sabbatical time. And then lastly is to protect it, is to make sure that you have some safeguards ahead of taking your sabbatical for making sure you're going to sabbatical well. Because as pastors, I think it's going to be really easy to be tempted, like you guys mentioned, day 1, day 7, however long it takes, to be like, okay, maybe I should just go back to this for this one thing. And so have safeguards to protect yourself, to make sure that you're going to run the course of your sabbatical season and to do it the way that hopefully will be the most fruitful.
You know, today this topic has led us to talking a lot about our identity. And earlier I mentioned there were 2 images that came to mind. The first was the ephod, but the other was one that I heard as a seminary student at a preaching conference. And it was a pastor who owned a farm, a hobby farm. And she shared a story about how she had this little dog, little small breed dog, who had a dog collar, with a little ID, with their little name tag and so on. And the dog came in one day, a couple days in a row, and the dog was all scratched up. And discover what happens, the dog would get out in the bushes in the briar, and the collar was getting caught, and the dog would fight it, and then he would get all scratched up. And she said, incredibly articulate, like the best preachers can do, she said, and so what we realized was we needed to loosen the collar so he could slip out of it and let his identity go for a few minutes so that he didn't get all scratched up. And the whole room of pastors went, oh. Because she didn't even have to describe, it was such a beautiful double analogy, the collar taking off this thing. And I think that's so much what sabbatical does. It gives it that moment of going, we're more than this thing, and it keeps us from getting scratched up. Could step up, walk away safely. So that's our hope for our people, that they would be able to find those ways to continue in ministry and wear that collar proudly, wear that identity proudly, but in a way that continues to be healthy. I hope you have a wonderful last month of sabbatical, Curtis.
Thank you.
I can't wait to hear how God keeps transforming you. And we'd remind you that you can reach out to Ken and his team if you want to talk about helping your pastor sabbatical, or if you're a pastor who wants to talk about how you can talk to your church about it. Thanks for being here.